Okay, yeah, why don't you all come on up and take, I'd like to welcome our second panel, Chairman Sam Graves and Ranking Member Rick Larson from the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and Chairman Frank Lucas and Ranking Member Zoe Lofgren from the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology.
They were all together. Let's mix it up. We'll mix it up.
Move over there.
It's
You go there?
mix it up. If you, I dare you to refer to.
I am going to refer.
I dare you.
Well, it depends on if the question's asked.
Thank all of you, and Chairman Graves, I would welcome your testimony.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern and all the members of the committee. So the Securing Growth and Robust Leadership in American Aviation Act is a bipartisan 5-year reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration and the nation's aviation safety and infrastructure programs. The bill was developed in collaboration with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Ranking Member Rick Larson, Aviation Subcommittee Chairman Garrett Graves, and Aviation Subcommittee Ranking Member Steve Cohen. We introduced the bill after soliciting input from all of the members of the House and the stakeholder community. In fact, we had more than 2,000 priority requests that were submitted to the committee. And last month, we spent 9 hours marking up this bill, which incorporated more than 50 T&I member amendments and ultimately passed it by a recorded vote of 63-0. The legislation is a major priority because the FAA's current authorities expire September 30th, and any lapses in authorization is going to wreak havoc on FAA programs, and that's what keeps airplanes flying safely. As such, we must avoid any short-term extensions of the existing law. These types of stopgap measures do absolutely nothing to provide the long-term safety and certainty for the aviation community and the flying public that's required to meet the needs of today's advanced aviation ecosystems. This bill is a priority because for over a century, the United States has led the world in aviation safety and innovation. And unfortunately, our gold standard status is being threatened by increased global competition, rapid developments in technology, and a shortage of aviation professionals, and the FAA's own inefficiency and lack of leadership. Our bill is critical to keeping America the global leader in aviation, and it's vital to our economy and to the millions of jobs and to the 850 million passengers that depend on the national airspace system every single year. This bill ensures smart and targeted investment in infrastructure for our airports of all sizes, including smaller and general aviation airports. The bill improves the efficiency of the FAA through reasonable organizational reforms, making the agency more agile while ensuring safety remains the very top priority. This bill has the first ever general aviation title in the reauthorization, something that I'm very proud of and personally believe is fundamental to the long-term success of civil aviation as we know it, and that's because GA serves as the backbone of civil aviation. In fact, many of our pilots, mechanics, and other key aviation workers began their careers in general aviation. And this bill also addresses the growing workforce shortages across the board, which are a very true threat to the future of American aviation. Through the removal of barriers to entry for individuals and veterans interested in pursuing aviation, this bill encourages growth in the aviation workforce. And what's more, our bill maintains American leadership when it comes to the development and integration of new and emerging technologies into the airspace, such as drones and advanced air mobility. This act also includes an entire title dedicated to improving the flying experience of the traveling public. Issues that each of our offices get to hear about far too often from folks back home. And finally, this bill includes several safety-focused provisions to ensure that America continues to be the gold standard when it comes to aviation safety. One of the most important safety features in this title that reauthorizes is the reauthorization of the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, which investigates all civil aviation accidents and other significant transportation accidents as well for 5 years. Again, I would like to thank Congressman Larson, Congressman Graves, and Congressman Cohen, and all the members of the T&I committee for their hard work on this bill. And in closing, I urge support and the Rules Committee to grant a rule for consideration to the floor. And with that, I look forward to questions. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Larson, you're recognized for any opening comments you care to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 3935, the Securing Growth and Robust Leadership in American Aviation Act. I support this bipartisan legislation. It's introduced by T&I Committee Chair Graves, Aviation Subcommittee Chair Graves, Subcommittee Ranking Member Cohen, and myself. This bill is developed in a bipartisan way with a good faith effort over the life of putting it together to as well to protect the safety of the flying public, and it cements a safer and cleaner and more innovative and accessible future for U.S. aviation. Now, my goals for the U.S. aviation system have been clear: to advance American leadership in aviation safety and aerospace innovation, strengthen the U.S. aviation workforce, improve the passenger experience, including passengers with disabilities, and to foster environmental sustainability and resiliency. And this bipartisan legislation before you today does just that. The bill makes significant strides towards keeping the U.S. aviation system the safest in the world. For instance, we make an investment to help prevent runway near misses by expanding ground surveillance and detection capabilities to all large and medium hub U.S. airports. As unruly passengers as well continue to pose a threat to flight crews and other frontline workers, this bill protects workers by creating a task force on preventing assaults and enforcing the requirements that airlines establish employee assault and response plans. Our talented and dedicated U.S. workforce is the backbone of American aviation and makes the nation's leadership in aviation safety possible. And you can say this reauthorization is a jobs bill. It makes robust investments in preparing the next generation of pilots, maintenance technicians, manufacturing workers, and other critical aviation professions. Makes investments in those so they can compete in the rapidly evolving global aviation sector. For example, the bill significantly increases funding for the FAA's Aviation Workforce Development Programs, a top priority for aviation stakeholders across the board, and creates a National Center for the Advancement of Aerospace to expand the talent pipeline to all Americans. And crucially, the bill requires the FAA to hire the maximum amount of air traffic controllers who are vital to ensuring that the flying public arrives safely and on time to their destinations, as well as to adopt the most appropriate controller staffing model to meet growing needs. Our aviation workforce and nation's economy will grow when we deliver a livable wage and allow working families to more easily put food on the table and roofs over their heads. To that end, I support and ask to make an amendment from Representative Garcia of Illinois to establish a minimum wage and benefit standard for all airport service workers. But recent discussions as well regarding U.S. aviation workforce have focused on the supply of commercial pilots. And while some efforts, such as lowering the financial barriers to flight education, will help bolster the pool of U.S. pilots, other proposals did get into the bill and I think would have far less benefits. This is not to say that I don't support the overall bill, but there are some issues that I do have, and I just want to highlight for the Rules Committee as you consider your debate over this. Section 330 of the bill reflects a proposal to raise the mandatory retirement age for commercial pilots. Now, not only would the action do very little to resolve pilot workforce challenges, but creates needless disruption for pilots, airlines, and passengers. The mandatory retirement age for pilots is set internationally by the International Civil Aviation Organization, and that's at 65. And when it was last raised at 65, the U.S. followed suit to raise the U.S. law. Section 330, if it's enacted, would raise the pilot age of 65 to 67, and it would confine pilots as a result from flying domestic only because they would not comply with the international standard. So there's just some issues to consider as you consider an amendment from Representative Bergman and Garcia, which would strike Section 330. That amendment has 45 sponsors from both sides of the aisle, 23 Democrats and 22 Republicans. And I'd ask that you make it in order so that we can consider it on the floor of the House and let the House's will take its course. There's great bipartisan efforts to help restore air travel as a reliable mode of transportation as well. Recent flight cancellations and delays have shaken the flying public's confidence in our aviation system. And to get us back on course, this bill requires airlines to create resiliency plans to help prevent mass flight disruptions. It also takes steps to make passengers whole by requiring airlines to develop policies to cover food and hotel expenses from flight disruptions. I also know that there's been a lot of talk, and there are a lot of amendments you have to deal with regards to the DCA slots and perimeter issue. I've got some comments on that. I'll enter for the record. I just encourage you, if you make something in order, to do so, and we can again have the full House have that debate, and we can make a decision have the voice of the House speak to that. Whatever compromise that you all propose on the floor, we can take up. We'll manage the debate and move on with it. However you all decide you want to treat that. I would note as well an important set of provisions where the DOT will create a roadmap for airlines to reduce damage to mobility aids and require the department to improve training for airline personnel and contractors on assisting passengers with disabilities. It's a very critical provision, bipartisan support on the committee. I'd ask you to take a look. There's a lot in this bill. I'll just end my comments. You got a long night ahead of you. I will note, because of Sam Graves, Chair Graves' leadership, there's a lot of great stuff for general aviation. But importantly, we also increased the authorization for the Airport Improvement Program from $3.35 billion to $4 billion for the first time, and a preponderance of that increase is focused on general aviation airports. I think that's an important improvement to the bill. So a lot going on in this bill. I know you have nearly 400 amendments to walk through. Our staffs are committed to helping you decide, how to approach that. But overall, a lot of hard work, a lot of great bipartisan work. We like to think we're an island of partnership and perhaps a sea of partisanship around Capitol Hill. We'll do our part, even on the floor, as we move forward on the bill this week. And appreciate the time. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
You'll be delighted to know that robust as your total is, it's 1,100 fewer than last week. So
we are so
we are
thankful.
Very grateful to your committee.
We are thankful for NDA folks for releasing some of the pressure valve on that as well.
Thank you. We'll go next, obviously, to my very good friend and the senior member of my state's delegation, Chairman Lucas, for any opening comments he cares to make.
Thank you for allowing me to speak on this important bill today, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern. And thanks to Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson for putting together a solid bipartisan bill to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Administration. As you know, the Science Committee has jurisdiction over all civilian research and development activities, which include the work done at FAA. Our role in the FAA reauthorization is to inform the process by crafting legislation that supports their R&D to advance American aviation. We did that with H.R. 3559, the FAA Research and Development Act of 2023, which we unanimously passed out of committee last month. That bill, which has been incorporated into the legislation before us today, is the product of months of work through regular order. We gathered extensive feedback and held a legislative hearing to give our members a chance to directly question stakeholders, industry, and FAA representatives on how to best support innovation and modernization in American aviation. The result is comprehensive legislation that quite literally supports aviation from the ground up, from the durability of our runways to how we monitor traffic over oceans and remote areas. It accelerates the development of advanced materials for aerospace vehicle construction and supports research into how more accurately to predict weather to reduce delays and increase safety. And importantly, it ensures that safety continues to be the primary focus of FAA research and development by requiring a report on whether at least 70% of FAA's R&D funds are going towards improving safety. In short, we put together a solid framework to support FAA's research work, one that is appropriately tailored to the FAA's jurisdiction and strengths. The R&D included in this legislation will go a long way towards advancing American leadership in aviation and aeronautics. And that leadership, I'd like to emphasize this, is critical to our national security and our international competitiveness. For our economy to thrive, we need to be able to transport people and goods quickly, safely, and efficiently. Staying competitive means staying on the leading edge of aviation innovation. I believe the package before us today will ensure our leadership in global aviation for years to come, and I'd like to thank my ranking member, Zoe Lofgren, for working with me in good faith to develop the R&D portion of this legislation, and once again, thank Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson for incorporating our work into this package. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We now go to my very good friend, a gentlelady from California, ranking member of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much to Chairman Lucas. As he has outlined, we went through this bill very carefully. We had hearings, we had fact-based deliberations, and I guess the fact that it was approved 29-0 says something about the work that we did, and so far all of the bills in the committee have been approved unanimously, along with all of the amendments that have been adopted to bills before us. I would note, although we did not focus on this in the Science Committee, there is one section that I want to draw attention to because I think the science does not support it, and that's Section 431 of the bill to facilitate the sale. Well, it actually would require, although probably not intended to, the sale of leaded aviation fuel in a number of airports. As we know, the science tells us that there is no safe level of exposure to lead, and especially in children. And the industry has been moving away from lead-based fuel for a number of years. It's the only transportation sector that continues to have lead-based fuel. And there is now an unleaded fuel that is available for use to about 70% of the piston engine fleet. And the FAA tells us that there will be 2 additional fuels that should be available that will basically serve every small plane by the end of this year. Unfortunately, Section 431 requires airports to continue selling any fuel they sold as of October 5th, 2018, indefinitely. That would require, for example, there's a small airport in my district that only has 1 fuel tank. They're selling unleaded now. They would have to they'd have to sell leaded instead of unleaded, which I don't think is what we're trying to do. Also, it would require, for example, there's an airport in Washington that no longer sells MoGas because it's used by a very small number of airlines, and because it was economically unfeasible. This would require them to lose money by selling that again, which I don't think is what we want to do. And finally, it, through the effect of the phrasing, would prohibit regulations that have nothing to do with gas, for example, for environmental reasons or safety reasons or fire safety reasons. I have an amendment that I'll submit my statement for the record that would clean this up, add a sunset provision, and I think put us where we need to be. There's another amendment by Representative Olbernolte, who is a fabulous member of our committee. However, and I know that his amendment is well-intentioned, I don't think it solves the problem because of undefined terms. And I just want to close with this. The County of Santa Clara had scientists study the effect of lead on children around a general aviation airport. It was a peer-reviewed study, and they found that the lead in the blood of these children exceeded the level in Flint, Michigan, and you could see it in their report from the aerosols, from the takeoffs. Those children will be forever damaged, and that is being replicated across the United States. I think we need to use the science, work with the FAA, work with the EPA, and get to a usable fuel for GA that is not leaded as soon as possible. in this section, I think, would prevent that. With that, I would ask unanimous consent to put both that statement and my statement praising the chairman in the record.
Without objection. Well, thank all of you and for your testimony. I want to spend just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about the process that you went through and just get it into our record so people understand exactly how thorough and thoughtful both the chair and the ranking member transportation were. You know, it's, as we all know, it's not easy to report out a bill unanimously from a committee, and I just want to begin by congratulating you both. I wish you both had been here to hear Ranking Member McGovern and my opening statement, because we very seldom are in that much agreement and that much universal praise. So that's an accomplishment. I don't know that we've done that this year, as my friend pointed out in his opening testimony. So again, how long, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, I'll address these questions to both of you, did you actually spend debating the bill and dealing with amendments?
It was approximately 9 hours. We did it over 2 days. We had the congressional baseball game and the congressional soccer game that kind of was in the middle of all of that. So we had to adjourn and come back. But it took us about 9 hours to put it
I'm glad you had your priorities straight. Let me ask you as well, during that time, how many amendments were offered and how many actually received votes?
So we had 137 amendments that were filed. We adopted 52 of those, and if you break it down by party, there were 88 Republican amendments and 49 Democrat amendments. We had 6 recorded votes, which included final passage, and so of those, we had 2 amendments that failed by a recorded vote and 3 amendments that passed by a recorded vote. So just kind of give you an idea.
And on the ones that were drawn, can you explain to us what factors surrounded that? What were the discussions surrounding members who chose to withdraw?
Well, my goal is to allow anybody that's got something or got an amendment, I would like to figure out a way to be able to accommodate them. Not all amendments, I can do that. Some amendments I just flatly disagree with, but there were amendments that have flaws and amendments that have problems, and what I would basically do is ask a member if they would withdraw, then we'll continue to work with them moving forward and try to come to an agreement or fix whatever we see the problem may be, and then, you know, by the time we get to the floor to this process, then we might be able to accept it. So.
You know, if I could just kind of confirm that, what the chair said, that what we tried to do in the committee was be as accommodating as possible, but if there were some problems that either one of us had with an amendment when we felt that we couldn't support it at the time, we did commit to try to work with members before we got to the floor. Some of that's reflected in the long list of amendments you see. We have our opinions on those. I think we've communicated to staff, and we'll see where those can go. But the other thing I would note is, as Sam mentioned in his testimony, well ahead of time, the amount of time we put into getting member input into the bill in order to craft the bill in the first place. It was a very bipartisan effort. As the Democratic lead on the committee, I do want to thank the chair's team on the Republican side of the aisle for as open as they were, you know, providing an opportunity for us to get our Democratic priorities in the bill. I would say not as much as we wanted, but I get it. We're in the minority, but still a lot more. And I think if you talk to the members, the reason you get a 63-0 vote, meaning as well Democrats voted unanimously for this, because a lot of the members in the committee felt not only the process worked for them, but there was content in the bill that they felt strongly enough about to be able to vote yes.
Yeah, so just to be clear, because you know how this place is, and sometimes impressions don't match up with reality, but if a member had chosen to move forward with a vote, they certainly would have been able to do so. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll just give you an example. So Mike Collins had an amendment, which there was a lot of opposition to from various members in the committee, and he chose to move forward, and he rolled the opposition. His amendment was adopted. So you absolutely can do that, and it's part of the process. We're all representatives here, and we all represent our districts, and and that's a choice that a member makes, and I guess a gamble to a great extent too. But, he was able to do it.
And I assume Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren, kind of similar in your thing, anybody wanted to offer something did, and you worked with it together. Obviously, again, as in the T&I, the fact that it came out unanimously is a pretty strong testimony about how well you guys worked together.
Absolutely. We had a good base bill. We had a good hearing with stakeholders and industry and FAA representatives. We took as much time as necessary. Then in the markup itself, the final numbers speak for it. The one thing I would note is there was a discussion about certain diversity issues, and I made a commitment to one of the Democratic members of the committee that what she was correct in noting needed to be addressed had to be something that we needed to work out because it's an issue that will appear in all our legislation. So we're working on that as a side caveat. But I think everyone was satisfied with the process, and no one was denied an opportunity to speak or to offer their perspectives. I yield to my ranking member.
I concur. I think I haven't heard any complaints from other members of the committee, and I thought the process was orderly and clear.
Well, I know all four of you fairly well. I've never seen any of you be very shy about making your points. Do you need to add something?
Yeah, just the point. This is not to say that every amendment that got in the bill that I liked, but that wasn't the point of getting to a unanimous vote. We got our chance to vote, and as a result, again, the process worked. And as I would tell some folks, this isn't a bill about issue A or issue B or issue C or issue D. This is a bill about the alphabet, right? It's not a bill about one thing. It's a bill about the FAA reauthorization. And there's a lot of goodness in the bill, despite maybe a difference of opinion on a few things.
Absolutely. Well, again, I just want to thank all four of you for the work that each of you did and that the members under your respective leadership did on both sides of the aisle. I just think it's a quite remarkable achievement, and as somebody that has a big interest, and not maybe quite as big as my friend Mr. Lucas, because he's got the Mike Monroney Aeronautical, training center in his district, but all of us in Oklahoma are proud of that facility, and again, we just think you produced a really excellent work product, and look forward to continuing to work with you moving through the process. With that, let me yield to my very good friend, distinguished ranking member, for any questions he may have.
Well, thank you. I'll be brief. First of all, I want to echo what the chairman said, that we began this with high praise for all of you for the product that you brought before the Rules Committee today. I mean, 63-0 is a unanimous vote. I mean, it's hard to get agreement on what to have for lunch, never mind on a FAA bill of this magnitude. I will say that when we considered the National Defense Authorization Act, that came out of the Armed Services Committee 58-1, which is a pretty bipartisan vote. And then the Rules Committee screwed it up by making amendments in order that a fringe element of the Republican caucus insisted on, and then you had a very, very partisan vote at the end. I mean, if that's, so I would hope that you would urge the Rules Committee, don't screw it up. Don't do a repeat of what they did last week, because you will not have a bipartisan vote. You will have a very, very partisan vote. Let me just say one other thing, and that is that there are a lot of issues that are of concern. Some of us are very concerned about the increase in retirement age for pilots. Mr. Bergman and Mr. Garcia have an amendment which I strongly support. I think that's a mistake. And no matter where you are on that issue, I think we would all agree that we should debate that issue on the floor, and there should be a vote. We agreement on that? I agree. Okay. Well, so here's my, before we report this rollout, here's one of the little challenges that we face. So, if we were simply coming to the Rules Committee and someone was offering an amendment to increase the retirement age, there'd be no issue. But because that's in the bill, and we're asking to go back to where it was. CBO scores it. And CBO, I don't know, I think it's like $8 million or whatever like that. So there are a number of ways we can fix this. You can waive cut-go, which is probably not going to happen. We can find an offset for this so that it can be offered, because I do think it's an important enough issue to be able to, we should have a debate and a vote on it. Or we could, do a self-executing rule that gets us back to what it was before it was amended, and then make an order the amendment to raise the retirement age. But however the chairman in his wisdom decides to do it, I hope that we will find a way to make sure that, the Bergman-Garcia et al. Amendment can have its day. Are you going to tell me you got to take care of?
Gentleman yield?
Yes.
I just make a quick point. You've sat in this chair. The chairman always has the responsibility. The chairman doesn't always make the decisions. I yield back to my friend.
And I know, left to his own devices, he would make the right decision. But I do think that this is a serious enough issue where we ought to find an accommodation so that there is a vote, and there is what was the vote on raising the retirement age in the committee?
My recollection, it was 32-31.
So it's pretty divided, right? So there's a division on this. It's one of these issues, again, I would hope that you will work with the chairman and whoever's making the decisions, right? To say that this can be fixed, right? I don't know how it will turn out if there was a floor vote, but it can, it can be fixed a number of ways, which is not going to, cause a lot of, shouldn't cause a lot of consternation. But I mean, but again, $8 million. I think it's $8 million. Do you know what the CBO score is on this? So $6 million. I mean,
If we keep talking about it, it might be 4.
right. Well, but in the scheme of things, if we had to find an offset, if that's the way that you chose to go, I mean, you ought to be able to find $6 million in order so that we can have this debate and have this vote. And I would just hope we could all work together and make that happen, because I think it would be a shame if, we were not able to have that. I don't know how it will turn out, but I just think it would be a shame if we didn't have that vote. But again, thank you all for your work, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
I want to thank each one of you for coming and spending your time today. And Chairman Cole, appreciate you asking about that. I was one of the ones that questioned about the manager's amendment, and Chairman Graves addressed some of it. We got something in writing, so thank you for that. Three quick questions. On the trust fund, was there much discussion on the way the money was spent? As of 21, you got a $14 billion surplus. And the purpose of the trust fund is to fund, as y'all know, infrastructure, improvements, research. So my question is, was there much discussion on that? Who determines where the money, how that money is spent, I guess is the question I had.
Well, yeah, it's formula. It's formula dollars, and we do have. One of the nice things about transportation is we still have true trust funds. We still have silos of dollars, and we have money in the aviation trust fund. So if you go back in history and you look at the reason why the trust funds were created and why we have an AIP program, which is where a lot of that money goes to, and it's the Airport Improvement Program. It was to improve small and medium-sized airports, to get general aviation off of the big airports because it creates more congestion. If you've got a Piper Cub sitting there and a 747's waiting on that Cub to take off, it creates problems. So we created this program years ago, back in the 70s, to have robust general aviation community, get those aircraft off of the big airports. Well, it's language we've been spending about and I'm going to specifically speak to AIP, about $3.35 billion on AIP programs in all of our districts, and it's been this flat for the last 20 years. And the main reason for that increase is to use that money and to improve more airports. Now, one of the things that we do, which I think is interesting, traditionally we've funded the FAA out of the trust fund at about 90%. The rest came from general revenue. Our bill increases that to at least 98% funded through, and that's user fees. You know, that's what we pay in as a result of flying, and it's fuel taxes is what it is. And so we're raising that to 98%, to at least 98% to fund FAA. And so I think that's a great thing. We're taking it out of general revenue and making sure that it is truly a user-funded system. As far as, you know, how the money gets spent, most of it's formula dollars. Like, for instance, with AIP, it's determined on different states do it different ways. Some states pass the money out themselves. Some states allow that money to flow right through to airports, and they get a certain amount of money each year. They can add that up over time so that they have a little bit bigger, I think over 4 years, you can add that up and be able to do a little bit bigger project, whatever the case may be. So it's mostly through formula dollars when it comes to the funding.
And it applies equally per the states?
But every state, again, they all do it a little bit differently. Some of them, the money flows direct, some of them goes to the state, and then the state divvies it out. You have block grant states, you have non-block grant states.
Right. Who makes the formulas?
Who makes what?
Who makes the formulas on how the money is distributed? I've heard some complaints that and they run a pretty good, for a trust fund to have $14 billion in it is interesting. And I've heard the complaints that, you know, you're a pilot, so goes airlines, both private and public. So goes the economy in a lot of ways, but it's the maintenance that they're not happy with, or I guess now they're questioning the funding of and how that's decided.
You mean between like large airports versus?
Correct.
Well, you know, again, it goes back to the history. The airlines wanted GA off the big airports so that they quit screwing up and creating congestion at the big airports. That's the reason why we have the AIP program to begin with, is so that we fund those smaller airports and we get GA off of the big airports. So, you know, now they're saying we want that money back, and I guess that means with it, you're going to have more GA traffic at large airports, which would be a disaster. So
But is there
I find it fascinating that you have some, you know, actually saying that. And in fact, with this increase, the large airports are going to see an increase as well, because we're going to $4 billion a year. They're going to see an increase in what they get.
But as far as who controls the formulas, is that a committee? Is that who would make up?
Just my understanding of AIP is that it's based on employments in and out of an airport. That's kind of the first driver of the dollars.
It's graduated.
Yeah, and then the second thing I make about the increase from 335 to 4 billion that we put in the bill, about 70% of that is focused for GA as opposed to 70-30. The current, at 335, it's something like 67-33 for the larger airports.
Okay.
So we're actually, the increment is going to be slided, leading towards more GA money, which is actually going to bring down the overall to somewhere in the 60-40 range or something, for large to small.
Well, you might want to just ask, you haven't got a lot of influence, ask the questions about that, because, and I don't know, like you're saying, Chairman, I don't know whether it's justified or not. I know it's been talked about for a number of years.
There are grants out there too available that are outside of AIP that are, I mean, some airports, you know, it's just what they need in terms of a new runway or whatever is just going to be astronomical. And they do those grants much like the Highway Department does, or that DOT does when establishing.
Oh, and finally, on the your disabilities, I forget what you called it, but it's y'all extended it or enhanced that. Is that, and the reason I'm asking the question is, we're seeing, and Sam, you're talking about the Piper holding up a 747. We're seeing customers who are claiming disabilities. We had one the other day that claimed she was overweight, would not get out of the aisle seat, said she would not move. There's nothing that held the airplane up for an hour. What, was that addressed in this bill? I mean, is this codifying, or I guess, making that easy for somebody to claim a disability of being overweight. Another one said he had a hurt leg, it wasn't gonna move, and I don't know who makes the call.
In a lot of cases, the airlines make that call, and it's a nightmare, believe me. It's a nightmare. The same thing, you get into the same thing with service animals. I remember, we used to have TWA headquartered in the state of Missouri. And I remember TWA had a big problem because a lady brought a service pony on board. And the service pony obviously took up 2 seats and sat there and it defecated all over the airplane. And it was a problem. And they had to do something. But the airlines, they for the most part set those rules. There are guidelines that the FAA puts out there, but it's hard to. I mean, that's a rock and a hard place, to be quite honest with you, and it's not.
Well, I would
we
ask
don't address it.
your
We don't
committee
change it.
to.
And you may.
Well, yeah, it's in Title 7 of the bill addressed. This is where some of these things are addressed. What we're really trying to focus on is, well, build upon what our former colleague Jim Langevin had introduced last year from Rhode Island. And then we had a bipartisan group of members take up that mantle to introduce these bits of legislation, largely focused on folks who are wheelchair bound or have to use mobility aids, and as opposed to addressing the issue you're talking about specifically, the sections where the improvements we are talking about have to largely focus on wheelchairs, how wheelchairs are treated, how they're stored, how they're put in cargo holds, how the customer is protected. If that wheelchair is damaged, and then asking the FAA to look at whether or not we can actually have people get their wheelchairs on the plane themselves as well. So kind of looking at the future a little bit. So that's more of the focus of the language that we put in the bill as opposed to this particular issue that you brought up.
It's more general.
Well, what I see is that the stewardesses and the personnel there are scared to do anything. And it's tremendous, and you're right. People are bringing dogs, cats, animals. They had 4 cats on the plane I had today. And then, so any letter that y'all could do, backing up the airlines and not letting them shy away, it's holding up. No wonder the delays are there. And that's just one of the issues. Y'all's committee could do it, and I would just request you to at least back them up on enforcing it, because they act like their hands are tied. We sit there. So anyway, thank you all for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, and thank you to all of those who are testifying today. Really just thrilled with the bipartisan work that you've put into this bill to produce a clean bill with full support from the committee. Testament to the good work that can be done when members put people over politics and work together in the public interest. The bill has a lot of provisions that we absolutely need to make sure that air travel is safer, more efficient, and improves the passenger experience for all, and particularly to address the issues regarding access for people with wheelchairs. I get a lot of constituent inquiries about that, especially from seniors and veterans. But I did want to point out a couple areas where we would love to see slight improvements in the bill. As Chairman Graves indicated, U.S. airports are struggling to compete with those overseas, often because those overseas are newer or other countries are providing more robust support. As the representative for Philadelphia International Airport, I'm generally going to be advocating for more airport funding. While this FAA bill does increase funding, airport funding, as well as the scope of projects that are eligible, we need to do more to ensure that we have first-rate airports to serve our public. And I strongly disagree with the provision to raise the pilot retirement age to 67 for all the reasons articulated by the ranking member, and I hope that a path forward can be found to fix that. Given the amount of strong bipartisan disagreement with this provision, it's disappointing that it was included in the base text of the bill rather than allowing it to be the subject of an amendment that could be debated and voted upon by the entire House. But beyond those issues, this is a good compromise. It's what's possible when we have members and a knowledgeable committee that can cut out the partisan nonsense. So I sincerely hope that we can avoid the type of poison pill amendments that tainted last week's proceedings, and I would yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, distinguished Vice Chairman, recognized for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You may not want to recognize me. I just spent multiple hours stuck at DFW and then on the tarmac here at Reagan. So my opinion of commercial airlines right now is not very high.
Gentleman else, just so you know, Ranking Member McGovern also had some things he needed to get off his chest before we got to.
And in fact,
Not alone.
due to the miracle of in-flight Wi-Fi, I've actually been listening to the hearing the entire time. So, Representative Graves, Chairman Graves, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned some point earlier in this discussion about the title on general aviation. Can you speak to that a little bit and why that's so important?
Well, you can just about include every occupation in aviation, whether that's a technician or a mechanic, even an air traffic controller, a pilot. They got their start in general aviation. If we don't have a robust general aviation sector and access to general aviation, then we're not going to have that pipeline to fill those. And we already have a void. We have a huge void right now in all of those positions. So that's why it's so important. It all starts with general aviation, and ultimately branches out into everything else in aviation. And far too long it's been overlooked, and as just being an airline, the system just being about the airlines, and that's just not the case.
So you mentioned this is the first time that title has been in the FAA reauthorization. Was there a particular reason why this time it became a feature?
Well, I am a product of general aviation. I have a rating as an airline transport pilot, but I got started in general aviation, and I'm a believer in general aviation, and I want to push and advocate for general aviation, and it's it touches everybody. It's important to all of our smaller communities. You have access now to better health care as a result of life flights and air ambulance. You have more economic development as a result of airports. There was a saying that I always enjoy repeating, and I can't attribute it to anybody. I think everybody says it, but you build a mile of road and you can go a mile, but you build a mile of runway and you can go anywhere in the country. And with general aviation, that allows that access for so many and so many communities. So it's important to me, and I'm the chairman, so I put it in.
There you go. Well, there were several times today where I thought, if I renewed that darn private pilot's license, I would not be so dependent on commercial air travel and not be held hostage by their inability to schedule properly.
And if I could say, it's important to chairman, so we supported it as well.
I get it. So let me ask you on the pilot age thing, somewhere along the line I missed the discussion, and it sort of happened right at the end. Did you have a hearing on this? Did you get expert testimony from medical officers and that sort of thing?
We had, just in committee, we had a pretty robust debate, to be quite honest with you, and I can't answer the question on who has come in and supported it and not support. I can tell you who doesn't support it, but as far as who supports it, and again, it's a pretty robust debate, and there's the speculation surrounding too. If the international community is at 65 and then we have pilots at 67, will they be able to participate in overseas flights? And that has yet to be seen. I believe that they will accept the same standard. That is my thorough belief. We also have a problem right now with pilot shortage. That's one of the reasons why we're having crew shortages everywhere, whether that's flight attendants or pilots. We're having crew shortages, and that's contributing to the delays that we're seeing and the cancellations that we're seeing. And this is not the end all by any stretch of the imagination, but it is helping, or it will help in terms of allowing pilots to serve just a little bit longer. And as we try to bring pilots up through the pipeline to get to where we need to be.
Well, the line comes to mind, wouldn't want to exploit the youth and inexperience of a 67-year-old. in the FAA bill. Thank you all very much for I know you've worked very, very hard on this, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you very much, and I really do appreciate, and it was similar to what we had last week, where we had the committee ranking and chair come in and really describe the process of what you went through, very extensive process, lots of hearings, lots of coordination, and that is very, very welcome, and so I want to thank you for doing it on both the Transportation Committee and the Science Committee. I really do appreciate the effort to eliminate lead from the fuel source. Although I will point out that somebody talked to me about sustainable aviation and that you could do algae. And New Mexico, I just put a plug in it. New Mexico has a lot of sun, a lot of bad water, and a lot of land we can't grow anything else on. So, that would definitely eliminate lead, algae, let's put it out there. But I do want to thank you. And the other piece that I think is important is the manner in which this bill also affects rural areas and the coverage for them. I'm wondering if you could just, maybe each of you, Chairman and Ranking, discuss how you think this bill would be seen and how it actually assists in general aviation in our smaller towns and cities.
Well, just on the outside, increase in AIP is going to have a huge help because those airports, they're expensive to keep up. And you have to have a good, it's one thing to have a pothole on a road. It's another thing to have a pothole on a runway because it can be devastating. And so it gets very expensive to keep up those airports and the runways in particular, the taxiways after that. And this is going to be it's going to be really, really good for general aviation in our small communities because that's where the money is targeted, is to the small and medium-sized airports. So that's probably the biggest thing it's going to do to help, in my opinion, to help.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think that is actually true. I will say that we had an award, a grant that we talked about probably 2 weeks ago, and we used that quote because it was for one of our small airports, and you build a runway, you can get to the world. And so, that is a very good quote. We used it. Ranking Member Larson, your thoughts on the benefits of this for rural communities?
Sure, I would add that we've also preserved the Essential Air Service Program in the bill, and that's critical. There's an amendment to strike that. I would hope that we don't. I think the Essential Air Service is in fact essential. And,
right.
It is a lifeline for our smaller communities. And I will just reiterate on the AIP increase from 3.35 to 4. That increase is predominantly focused on smaller, which tend to be general aviation airports that are largely in more rural areas than not. So, again, there is a conscious bipartisan effort to recognize the role that smaller and rural airports play.
And I think the bipartisan infrastructure law also allowed some of those increased funding for the smaller airports, and that we need to talk about it more often. So many of us represent rural areas, and the federal government does what it's supposed to do, which is invest in infrastructure in those places that could not sustain it, like the way we did with electrification, the way we're doing with broadband. And this is a critical infrastructure, and so thank you for focusing on that on behalf of all of our rural communities. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank the chairman. Either the ranking member or the chairman, could you comment on the important role that the passenger facility charge plays in funding these improvements to airports?
I can start with that. Just that PFC plays a critical role in helping to finance construction of airports. Airports have a little bit more control over that, but they also coordinate their plans with the airlines. And so, we certainly need to continue to maintain, continue to have a passenger facility charge in place.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, it obviously it provides for some things too outside of what might qualify under AIP, and it's it's part of the process. And again, it's worked out between the users of the airport and the airlines, and then obviously and the traveling public, because they pay it, and the local airport authority.
What is meant by a four corners bill? And is this a four corners bill? I'll give you the first crack, Mr. Chairman.
So it's, so what we call basically, as you work through the process, the ranking member and chairman and the ranking member and chairman of the subcommittee, we work through everything, and if somebody wants to disagree, then we pull it from the bill, and then we try to work it out through other means or through an amendment or something like that. So.
I'd say it's a pretty accurate description. It also requires us, in order to get a bill done, we try to ensure that if one person opposes or supports an amendment, then the other three will try to as well oppose or support that amendment, keep the process moving. And say we do that, I think, and this is a process that has existed regardless of majority in this committee, and it does keep things moving. But I would also note it's produced a 773-page, very substantive FAA reauthorization, and has helped create that process to do just that.
I might add, too, it's not the end-all. What it does is require us to have to work together to try to come to a compromise on whatever particular issue it is.
I think it's good to start out with the vision of where you'd like for it to end up, but I think it's important that we still allow some flexibility here, and we allow as many of these amendments to get a vote as they can and have say on the floor. And the bill may not end up exactly where the four corners wanted it to be, but I assume, do you anticipate the Senate is going to pass a version of this bill and then we would conference with them, or would they vote on the bill that we pass out of the House?
That's up to the Senate.
Yeah.
Ideally, they would have a bill, we'd have a bill, and we'd go to conference.
I imagine they're going to want their say, even if there's two corners over there that have agreed, there's still 98 other senators. So I don't know the answer to that. I just wondered if you all knew what their schedule is.
No, my position throughout the process is that we have our obligation in the House of Representatives to be responsive to getting an FAA bill done and to listening to our members. We'll get our product completed, and then the Senate will do its process.
Well, I think you've worked on some really hard problems here and moved the ball forward on a lot of things. There's no bill is perfect. Maybe some of these amendments that are going to be offered will make it perfect. I know that the chairman, in the case of a Four Corners bill, the ranking member thinks it's closer to perfect than the rest of us might think. But if the chairman and the committee chooses for me to manage this bill, I'll give it the best to manage the rule. I will, as a member of the Transportation Committee, I will give it the best launching pad possible. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized for any questions he may have.
Thank the chairman. There's some debate, as was raised earlier by the ranking member, about the equal divide on the raising the age issue. The question I have for y'all as the committee experts on it is whether or not there's a debate about whether there is in fact a shortage of pilots or not. There seems to be, by my study and review, a significant shortage impacting the current state of affairs and also looking ahead into the future. I wondered if the chairman and the ranking member could comment on that.
I believe there's an absolute shortage. I mean, ALPA would tell you there's not, but it's in their best interest to say
Right.
there is. But having said that, there's an absolute shortage of pilots, and we're seeing it. We see it every day. What happened as a result of COVID was many pilots decided to take early retirement, and they did. And they're not coming back now, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't either. And so we have a process to, a pipeline. Well, that pipeline for getting new pilots in is severely stressed right now. And what's happening is, more than anything else, is the big airlines are pulling all of the regional pilots up, and now the regionals are completely out of luck. they're going to have to, they got to go back to the beginning. I always make a joke of it, but I know when there's a pilot shortage because the airlines start sending out blanket letters to anybody that's an airline transport rated pilot. Come work for us. When I start getting those letters in the mail, I know there's a pilot shortage. When they're saying, come work for us, and this is what we'll pay, and this is what we'll offer you for, a signing bonus to do that, then I can guarantee you there's a pilot shortage. If they're reaching so far down in as to pull, an ATP like myself up, then there's a problem.
Ranking Member.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Thanks, Representative. We need more pilots. We need more pilots going through the system. We need more pilots in the system right now. So the bill in the Aviation Workforce Development Program actually triples the amount of dollars available for the overall program, and a third of that is for pilot training. So we're making the investment there. There's amendments that I believe we've either agreed to in a manager's amendment or certainly we worked on after the hearing or after the markup to work to better utilize veterans and bring them into the pilot supply. And then then individual airlines themselves are either partnering or have started academies to train a new pipeline, an additional pipeline of pilots for the future. So there's a lot of things going on. You mentioned the debate on the age, so I just would make a note on that, is that I do think that, again, the U.S. has followed the International Civil Aviation Authority or organization, ICAO. When ICAO increased the age from 60 to 65, the U.S. followed immediately. And I think there is a challenge if we go to 67 without the international standard. You're going to have a couple of things happen. One, older pilots bumping younger pilots. You're going to have problems with probably the collective bargaining agreements between unions and airlines and what that's going to mean for bumping rights. And third, I do think the international standard is going to limit the ability of pilots who are older than the international standard from flying internationally. That's the only information I've received. So I'm not sure we're solving a problem by raising that. I do think it's worth a debate, and it's worth a debate on the floor of the House, and I would agree with the Ranking Member McGovern if there's a way to get a bill or an amendment on the floor to have a fulsome debate on that as well. I personally be for it. I'm going to talk that through with the chairman. I'd personally be for it. But again, there's a lot of ways to get the pilot issue, and we're doing that in the bill.
So, I mean, I'll offer a few thoughts here just because I was an original sponsor of, Mr. Nell's bill that was then added into the bill that came through committee. I've got lots of reports back in the office and everything, but even just casually looking at, you'd pull up pilot shortage, just article after article after article, story after story after story. The only negative story that's come up on it about questioning whether there's a shortage is from the pilots union or the pilots association. Every other one, CNN, Fox, every one of these, just story after story. Forbes, the pilot shortage is playing havoc with air travel. Pilot shortage for 2023. Southwest CEO believes pilot shortage will last for 3 years. Goes through, talks about having 200 flights a day, 40 aircraft grounded. American, same thing, number of flights grounded. Reducing the number of flights available for American passengers, obviously making it more difficult for them to travel, and so forth. Obviously, the legislation would say that pilots over 65 would have to undergo the same medical exams every 6 months, EKG, all the same stuff would apply. The fact is, I mean, globally, I get the point with respect to the what happens and the impact on some of the complications if you're going to increase it in the United States. You've got some inability to fly globally, but there are a significant number of countries that have adopted a higher age standard, as y'all know. I don't have it in front of me. Australia, like Japan, fairly notably, up to 68 and so forth. I'd also note that the Airline Pilots Association opposed the age increase from 60 to 65 back in 2007, and then suddenly kind of got a little religion once the pilots all said they wanted to do it. It just strikes me that this is a common sense solution to free it up. And look, I'll just posit, I'm not a pilot. There are some greater experts in this room than I who are pilots. I am a passenger, which means I'm putting my life and my son's life, my family's life in the hands of a pilot. And so, safety's not lost on me. But when you've got two pilots sitting up there, both of whom have had to go through the same standards, physical tests, the EKG test, all the health stuff. I mean, if you're asking me to choose between the pilot with 30 years of experience who's sitting there in the cockpit who's 66 and the 30-year-old who just went through a fast-track training program, I'm going to take the 66-year-old pilot. So I'm just saying, that's just my 2 cents. That's where I come down on this, and the belief of being able to sort of expand this in a way that matches international standards that have now been proven in Japan, Australia. I think there's 9 countries, and I think we ought to be leading on that. This isn't a partisan issue. It's not an ideological issue. I'm just conveying my belief and why I share the view of those who adopted the amendment committee, and I hope we will move forward with it. And with that, I will yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much.
If I-
Gentlelady
Mr.
from
Chair?
Indiana.
I'm sorry.
Oh, gentlemen,
I want to know, there's nothing in this bill that either implies or authorizes any fast-track pilot training program. I just want to be clear about
Well,
that.
I agree with that, and I didn't mean that to sound pejorative. I'm just saying, when you read and start on terms of what we're trying to do to train up pilots, I'm just saying, okay, non-fast track. But I'm just saying, give me the 66-year-old who's been flying for 30 years, was a Marine pilot, and anyway, and I yield back.
gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the witnesses, particularly Chairman Graves and the ranking member, for your work on this important bill. I know that we've got about an 800-page bill with lots of amendments, and that's not lost on me that a great deal of work has gone into this already. I appreciate those efforts to keep the airways safe, and I yield back.
My favorite member. Gentleman from New York is now recognized for any questions he may have.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
It's a tie. We want to thank all of you for coming here, and again, reiterate, just thank you all for great work you did on getting us to this point, and we'll try not to screw it up going forward. So the witnesses are excused. Okay, we clearly have a lot of members here, more than we can handle in one panel. Mr. Massey is going to want to testify, but he can do that from the dais. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bergman, Mr. Rouser, Mr. Smucker, Mr. Smith, and if we can get him in, Mr. Muser. I think we may have to pull up one additional chair. Yeah, there's one over here. Can we pull up one more chair? That's what I was afraid of. There we go. And Mr. Smucker, if you could move down a little bit so we could squeeze in one. No, the other way. Yeah, just move down a little bit, Mr. Collins, if you could. The other way. That way you can pull in. We've got as many here as we can. Now, just as a procedure before we begin, we'll start on the left, we'll move to the right. We will have to recess about 6:45. If you guys can get done by then you can all be excused. If you're not, you all have to come back after the last vote because the panel will want to be able to ask you questions. So I just say that as a word to the wise. We'll start, Mr. Bergman, with you.
Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern for allowing me to testify before the Rules Committee this evening. As one of 2 commercial airline pilots serving in Congress, my comments are based on experience, not conjecture. In fact, almost 3 decades, that's decades ago, I argued this issue from the other side. At the time, the issue was raising the age from 60 to 65. I was in favor because the change enabled a significant number of pilots to maintain prolonged productivity in the domestic airline route system. However, as proposed in the current language, the age increase not only does not solve pilot productivity issues, it exacerbates pilot availability by requiring a significant retraining requirement. Said a different way, changing the mandatory retirement age for commercial airline pilots from 65 to 67 accomplishes nothing with regard to productivity and, most importantly, nothing related to safety. My amendment, which employs broad bipartisan support, is co-sponsored by more than 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats and was submitted to the Rules Committee in a timely manner, includes a letter to the committee with the names of the co-sponsors, complies with all applicable House and budgetary rules, and is germane to the underlying measure. Earlier this year, a group of Republicans worked with Speaker McCarthy to craft changes to the House rules to empower rank-and-file members by opening up the House to allow every member an opportunity to debate and vote on a broader range of issues. I want to thank Rules Committee member Congressman Roy for spearheading this effort to ensure the people's voice is heard, and regardless of our individual thoughts on this particular amendment, I am sure we can both agree it is of the utmost importance to have this debate on the floor in front of the American people. While I understand it is customary for the Rules Committee to not make amendments in order that amend a section of a bill that was voted on in committee, the broad support this amendment enjoys shows the desire for many of our colleagues, especially those not on T&I, to have a chance to weigh in on this crucial policy change. Now, later today, we got the information CBO, so I wasn't going to make comments on it, but I am going to make a couple of comments on the CBO score. Simply, it's inaccurate. It does not factor in the vast majority of airline pilots are not covered by a defined benefit pension and thus are not subject to the PBGC. There are no passenger carriers with pilots who are covered by an active defined benefit pension plan, which has not been frozen or terminated. For the terminated pension plans, the PBGC cost and the pilot benefits do not change because those benefits were frozen or fixed on the date of termination. The only pilot groups covered by active plans in which pilots continue to accrue benefits are FedEx and UPS. They don't carry passengers, which is a very small slice of the overall FAR 121 pilot workforce, approximately 7%. The FedEx legacy pension has a cap on years of service and compensation, so there's nothing that's going to change that as relates to what the CBO mentioned. There are 5 frozen pension plans: Alaska, Hawaiian, Piedmont, Continental, and Northwest. Those plans have been frozen for several years, and because there are no new pilots entering the plans, there is a diminishing pool of participants for the plans. The Hawaii, Alaska, Northwest, and Continental plans would not be impacted by an increase in the mandatory retirement age to 67, since the retirement date under each of those plans is at age 60 at the time of termination. So the point is, and I'm just going to shorten it up here because there's a lot of, the CBO maybe makes a statement but really doesn't even tell half the story, and that's what I'm concerned about here, that you all have truth. And I guess to, as far as the pilot shortage, as we hear the term thrown about, the question is really, if there is, does the age 67 amendment help alleviate that pilot shortage? The short answer is no. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smucker. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern. Thank you for the opportunity to submit an amendment and speak on the importance of this amendment to my district and my community. And this has to do with Essential Air Service, or EAS, for rural and small community airports. Just quickly, by way of background, I see the EAS program as a critical lifeline that our government guaranteed to rural communities following airline deregulation to ensure that they maintain access to our nation's aviation network. The idea is simple. The program provides minimal incentives, small costs, to private companies to operate in rural communities that are not able to attract some of the larger commercial airlines to operate. So again, it's a small investment that keeps rural communities connected, improves safety by preventing our constituents from having to drive hours to reach the nearest large airport, and then it supports other airports by connecting rural passengers to international hubs where they can connect to the longer distance routes. It really is, it's a minimal investment to help sort of patch the market inefficiencies that occur. Airlines just simply would not provide service to these rural communities, and folks in those areas just simply would have to drive long distances to get to an airport. And then there's that's essentially my amendment corrects or takes back to original law changes that are made in the reauthorization bill that has come out of committee that would require a 5% match for a significant portion of those 172 airports across the country. It's 111 in the lower 48 in Hawaii, and 61 of those are in Alaska. But this would require a 5% match by local communities, which would be tough to do in my community and in many other rural communities. The communities are, these are often smaller airports, and they're operating on a tight budget, and they're already investing often millions of dollars in various projects in those airports. And then secondly, another small change that my amendment would do is coming out of the committee again, something that would affect the ability of Lancaster, the airport in my district, from participating in the EAS program altogether. The program currently allows some discretion by the secretary to determine the most traveled route to the nearest airport. And in my case, we're right on the borderline of meeting the 70-mile requirement, and you can find a way to get to the airport less than 70 miles, but not the way that's generally traveled. So that's an important discretion that we've given to the secretary. That language has been taken out. It would take Lancaster out of the EAS program altogether. In my area, and we have about 40 airports that would be impacted. We introduced this bill when we learned of it, this amendment, last Wednesday. We now have already 19 co-sponsors, bipartisan. But in my particular airport, we're the third busiest airport in Pennsylvania, behind Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But those flights to two nearby airports help to count as numbers of employments, which also it's sort of a domino effect. There are other funding that we can access because of the volume. We're planning a major new terminal at the airport, and we do have some potential additional commercial flights that would come into the airport. All of that would potentially be at risk. If the 5% match is required, we'd have to find a way to come up with that. And certainly if the language would prevent Lancaster from participating in EAS altogether. So again, as I said, we have 17 co-sponsors. This is a very small compared to the billions of dollars. We calculated, we don't have the exact numbers, but it's about $7 million that is provided in support for these 40 rural airports that would where that match would be required compared to the massive amounts of money that is going to support our aviation system, which is very, very critical. But this would have an outsized impact on my community and other rural communities across the country. We've made a promise during deregulation to ensure that that connection would exist, and so I ask you to consider my amendment to be made in order so we could have that debate on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Massey, I had meant to start with you, but if it's okay, you have to come back anyway. So I want to give these guys at least a shot. Mr. Rouser.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just mentally cut out 90% of what I was going to say, so I hope that adds to the merits of my amendments. The First Amendment would ensure taxpayer funds are not spent on drones the U.S. has determined to be a national security risk. Government agencies and the private sector have identified security risk associated with certain drone companies, and yet we still allow taxpayer funds to be used to purchase these drones by federal agencies specifically, and this amendment is tailored to the Department of Transportation and the FAA. Now, Congress has prohibited the DoD and the Coast Guard from spending taxpayer funds on drones of this nature. No such prohibition, as I mentioned, exists for DOT and FAA. This amendment fills that gap. I will add that there are 28 co-sponsors of that amendment. It's a bipartisan amendment. A couple modifications have been made, and I believe we have a four corners agreement on it at this point. So I appreciate and urge consideration of its adoption. The second amendment is number 351. It creates a medical portal modernization task group within the Aero Medical Innovation and Modernization Working Group that's established in the bill. Number one, if a pilot's medical evaluation is flagged, it is sent to the FAA for what's become an increasingly long duration without any update. Basically, the pilots have no way of tracking the status of their medical applications, as I understand it. And point three, some pilots have waited years for determination from the FAA without the ability to check that status. So this amendment simply addresses that problem. With that, I yield back and appreciate consideration of my amendments.
Thank you very much. Mr. Collins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Govern and the Rules Committee members. I think I got a hot topic that we've all been talking about tonight, and that's the shortage of airline pilots as well as the aviation mechanics. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this amendment to the tax title of the FAA authorization bill, which has 70 co-sponsors on it. After taking office in January and getting a seat on the aviation subcommittee, we began meeting with the stockholders to learn more about the challenges they were facing so that we could address them in this House bill that we're taking up this week. And you know, in every meeting, I don't care if it was airlines, large, small, labor groups, aircraft manufacturers, everybody, the common theme was workforce, 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 specifically how to reduce the barriers to the entry into aviation. And what I hear from everybody is that a strong aviation industry requires a steady supply of pilots and aircraft mechanics, but the cost of training in these fields far too often deters Americans from choosing these vital careers. So what do I mean? The price of becoming a commercial pilot can and often does exceed $100,000. And that's before you get the 1,500 hours flight time required to obtain that airline transport pilot certificate that Chairman Graves was talking about before you can even get into a commercial airline. So simply put, it's tough to get your career off the ground in an industry without incurring substantial debt, and particularly for low-income and rural Americans. And so as a result, we are dealing with a shortage of pilots and mechanics. As demand for air service grows and experienced pilots are forced to retire. This, in addition to a shortage of certified aircraft mechanics, will lead to flight delays, cancellations, and other challenges that will make it harder for airlines to meet their needs and expectations of the traveling public, which I was one this morning as well. Mr. Norman was right. The aviation industry contributes 5% of America's GDP. And so when aviation does struggle, the rest of our economy does as well. So while I was listening to stockholders and pilots and mechanics who came to talk to us about it, it became clear that we thought workforce was going to be a common theme. One of our staffers mentioned the 529 savings plan, which had been altered a number of years back to include trade and tradecraft. And so what if Americans could use the 529 college savings plan to attend FAA-certified commercial pilot programs or aviation technical schools, we could take care of a lot of this shortage. That 529 plan is a tax-deferred investment account that allows parents, often open for the kids to save for college. It's a forward-thinking way for working families to avoid crushing student loan debt and gradually save over the years. And like I said, initially this plan was just set up for four-year universities, but it has been changed to allow for apprenticeships in trades that are vital to our economy. That's why I introduced this legislation on this amendment to the tax title that is based to give our aspiring aviators and aircraft mechanics the same tools to get an education in their field as those seeking four-year degrees. Now, on March 28th, I introduced H.R. 1818 as the Aviation Workforce Development Act. It's got 137 bipartisan co-sponsors, 92 Republicans and 45 Democrats, with a wide array of industry and labor stockholders who are pushing this policy. So I want to thank all of you, our bill co-sponsors, including members Guy Rushenthaler, Ralph Norman, Aaron Haushen, and Nick Langworthy that are on this committee. And I also want to thank many of our industry and labor partners, and there's a ton of them. We've got a list of them. I just want you to keep in mind, if we enact this simple aviation workforce provision as a part of this once every 5-year aviation bill, next year, high school graduates could start taking advantage of this new opportunity. And with that, I thank you for your consideration.
I thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are going to have to recess. I apologize, and we're going to have to bring you back. So I regret that. If you could come as quickly as you can after the last vote, we'll get started as quick as we can. Again, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. Securing Growth and Robust American Leadership in American Aviation Act. As I recall, we finished Mr. Collins' testimony, so Mr. Muser, you're next up. You sound great to me. Go right ahead.
Localizing is fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Cole. Appreciate it. Appreciate all of the ranking member of the government, as well as all the members of the Rules Committee for this opportunity. I'd like to talk about Amendment number 196. Community Air Service Development Program, other known as SCASD, for rural airports that have been lacking commercial air service for more than a year. This amendment does not create a new subsidy program to be administered by the Department of Transportation. Rather, it is a rural economic tool necessary to help develop sustainable commercial air service in rural communities, like at the Williamsport Regional Airport within my district. To be eligible for these funds, the airport must not be larger than a small hub airport, was eligible to receive funds through the EAS program on or before January 1st, 2008, either possess or previously received Small Community Air Service Development Program grant, and has been without commercial air service since January 1, 2022. So it's very specific. This amendment also truly aims to help rural airports attract commercial air carriers and equip them to succeed without additional federal resources. The amendment would authorize $5 million per year over a 5-year period, total $25 million, which would increase access and, of course, economic opportunity for these underserved communities for 4 airports in particular that would meet this criteria. The community and cost-sharing requirements by the local government would be, under this case, about $500,000 per year. Mr. Chairman, it's important to note that some of these airports, particularly Williamsport, would subsidize the activity and gaining a commercial airline on their own, but this bill serves as a insurance policy, if you will, to the airlines to know that they will be receiving federal funding. So the Securing Growth and Robust Leadership in American Aviation Act, my amendment contains conservative fiscal guardrails to ensure that federal resources are provided in a responsible manner. These guardrails include a community cost-sharing plan, as mentioned, performance metrics in the form of a year-over-year employment requirement. So if it's not active and it's not moving forward, the funds can be pulled. A prohibition on establishing leisure routes, and a sunset provision after 5 years that would allow, of course, future Congress to determine whether or not to extend this funding mechanism. This amendment would require impacted airports to utilize local funds to qualify, as stated, consistent improvement with service, and bring in an airline to receive this funding. So the COVID-19 pandemic is what shut down this airport, as it has affected much of the aviation industry, particularly in rural communities. In my district, as stated, the town of Williamsport lost its commercial air service just then, October 2021. This is a town of about 30,000 residents, with nearly 200,000 in surrounding areas that would utilize this airport. The closest airports are a good 80 to 90 miles away, and without real highway access either. Mr. Lansworthy has Elmira in his district, and my constituents have to go up into upstate New York usually. So what it does is it leaves hundreds of businesses along with 9 colleges and universities within the Williamsport area. Not atypical for a rural community. We have the Little League World Series. People flying in, of course, from all over the world. That's coming up in August. I recommend you coming up. And just so many issues that are derived from not having access to this airport. When prior to the airport losing this air service, the Williamsport furnished $15 million in local renovation projects. This airport it's beautiful, it's top-notch with equipment and facilities, and I literally cannot talk with a small business, large business, a school, university, folks within the surrounding areas without hearing about the importance of this airport to the economic development and quality of life of this community. This amendment would help to fill a critical gap in rural Americans' access to commercial air service. So I would also like to thank my colleague and good friend, Chairman G.T. Thompson. He's co-sponsoring this amendment, and I'd like to thank all of you for this, of course, this opportunity today. I also want to thank Chairman Sam Graves and Aviation Subcommittee Chairman Garrett Graves for many meetings that we've had, for listening, for coming up with some better solutions here, and for many of their listening sessions. So with that, I look forward to answering any questions in regard to my amendment. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McGovern, thank you, and to the committee. My amendment, which is co-sponsored by Jeff Van Drew and Dr. Andy Harris, number 355, requires the president or his designee to certify that offshore wind turbine projects in the North Atlantic and Mid-Atlantic planning areas will not weaken, degrade, interfere with, or nullify the capability of radar relied upon by the Federal Aviation Administration or the Armed Forces. It would also require the DOTIG to conduct a review of the sufficiency of the process used to approve offshore wind turbine projects in areas critical to air travel and national security. The people of New Jersey are very concerned, as am I. We have raised our voices so far without any avail to our governor and to the president. About 3,400 wind turbines, 1,000 foot high, higher than any others that we've ever had. We've never had them in the water like this. And it's the size of the Chrysler Building in New York. And they will cause serious problems to the ecosystem, but that's not the reason why I'm here today. Whales are showing up on the shoreline, some 39 so far, and we get nothing but crickets from the advocates of this. But on radar, and I would also argue on sonar, but on radar, we're talking about the ability to cause it to malfunction, to see things that aren't there. And I don't just say that because this interference is something that is something that's been studied to some extent. There was a BOM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, interference analysis from August of 2020 that said the research team found that the proposed and hypothetical wind farms will cause interference. Interference. We have an airline pilot with us right now. We don't want to cause any interference when they're flying low level. And we want to be able to see anything coming over the horizon that might be not wish us well. We also had a 2017 ground-based coastal air surveillance wind turbine radar interference vulnerability study that said offshore wind turbines may pose unique impacts to coastal radar systems. There was that analysis was about the Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. Those turbines are 589 feet tall. Again, the ones that are going up off my coast will be 1,000 foot tall. And the blades each blade will be the size of a football field, counting the end zones. That's how large these things are, and they will disrupt radar. Allies such as Taiwan, Japan, Finland, and Sweden have all halted offshore wind development due to objections from their armed forces, concerns over radar and freedom of movement for aircraft. In the case of Taiwan, they already have some of these deployed. They're worried they may not see something coming over the horizon for them from the People's Republic of China. The DoD, to its credit, expressed concern about the offshore wind development off the Virginia coast, but they haven't gone far enough, and I hope that they will, with regards to other functions, including training, that may be malaffected. Ominously, a 2022 study, and I have it with me here, put out by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine found that wind turbine generation mitigation techniques have not been substantially investigated, implemented, matured, or deployed. And they talk about how it obfuscates the ability to have radar work effectively. So I hear, and I've read several of the environmental impact statements. They're this thick. I go through them with a yellow highlighter, and they keep saying you can mitigate this, mitigate that, mitigate this. This, the National Academy of Sciences says that we have not gotten to a point where there's any kind of mitigation strategy or anything that can be deployed that will help. We owe it to our population. All of you guys flew in, ladies and gentlemen. I drove down 95 on the turnpike, so I didn't have any of the same problems you had. But radar is essential, and if we weaken it because of ocean wind turbines, we have made a serious and egregious mistake. This will require a certification. We want it studied better, and it has not been. I appreciate you back.
Thank you very much. I'm going to see if there's any questions for this panel so we can get them out, and then Mr. Massey, you'll be the first up on the next panel, if that's okay. Gentleman from Texas, recognized for any questions.
I want to thank Chairman Smith for coming in and sharing this with us. You did last week on the NDAA. I thought your amendment should have been made in order on the NDAA. I hope we'll look at this very critically because it's information that really we should have before this continues to go forward. So I thank you for continuing to ring the bell and making certain that we all think about this.
Thank you, Dr.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania, no questions? Gentlelady from Minnesota. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Well, among the amendments offered here, I think one of the common themes is how do we pay for airports? And it's a tremendous, everybody that's got an airport or is near an airport realizes what a tremendous asset it is to have in the community. And so I support several of these amendments. But the question of how do you pay for it, I'll have an amendment on that later that would free up more money for the smaller airports and allow the medium.
Is this called double dipping?
It's called probably triple dipping because I'm going to manage the rule too, maybe. Now that I've been called out on it, I'll yield back.
Some people might think it's a rigged game. Sincerely thank all of you for your testimony and your proposals. Thank you very much for coming back. We're sorry we had to inconvenience you, but you're excused.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Massey, of course, will be testifying from the dais, and so we're going to try and get the rest of you up there. It may be a little tight, so forgive us for that. But Mr. Higgins, Ms. Green, Mr. Moylan, excuse me, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. Garcia, Mr. Owens, and Mr. Santos.
That is. Yeah. Yeah. Hey. All right.
Well, we thank our witnesses for coming. I'm going to start by recognizing Mr. Massey.
Well, thank you for letting me speak up here. It looks really cozy down there. I'd like to join you all. But my amendment addresses an issue that hasn't been addressed in 2 decades, and that is essentially how do you fund airports without raising taxes? And airports have 4 major sources of revenue. They get money from the airlines who use their airports for the gate fees, for instance. They get money from their local communities. Their communities can raise taxes and tax people. Even the people that don't use the airport get taxed if they use that revenue tool. They can come to the government with their handout and ask for AIP. These are Airport Improvement Program funds, and those are critical, but there's only so much money to go around. The fourth, and I think most important way that they can raise revenue is called a passenger facility charge. And the federal government artificially caps this number at $4.50. So the airport can only charge somebody who uses their airport $4.50 and no more. The rest of the money they have to get through federal grants or other ways. So if we would let them collect more of their own revenue, they wouldn't have to come to us asking for money. And this is a true user fee. The money that's collected on the airline ticket does not come to the government. It goes straight to the airport. But again, it's been capped at $4.50 since for over 20 years. And so what I've got is an amendment that says that the airports could charge as much as $8.50. This is kind of a deregulation. We're not saying they have to charge that. We're saying we're going to give them the freedom to charge up to that. And if they charge over $6, because some people are afraid they'll charge too much, if they charge over $6, they forego the grants. They say, we don't want any more federal grants. If we can charge $6 to use our airport, we don't need the federal government to give us a handout, and we will give up the handouts. And so we can reduce the amount of taxes the federal government collects and gives out, and the airports are generally in favor of this. So I've received encouragement. I don't want to say they've endorsed it yet until after we hear about the rule, but I've received encouragement from Airport Council International, FreedomWorks, likes this idea, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, National Conference of State Legislatures. They've all given me support on this amendment. It's something that's time has come. We allow the airlines to charge $50 to check your bags, but the airport can only charge $4.50 to let you use the airport. There's something wrong with that, and that's why they're perpetually underfunded. So the amendment's as simple as that. It is not a tax. It is a user fee, and it's kind of like deregulating the airport. So that, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. The chair recognizes Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the committee. This evening, I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify along with my colleague from Michigan to strike raising the pilot retirement age to 67. Here's what the raising the retirement age will do. It will make the U.S. non-compliant with the international safety standards. It would mean that pilots age 65 to 67 who are more likely to be on international routes would no longer be able to fly them. It would create a training backlog since airlines would be forced to train new pilots for these routes, and it will upend collective bargaining agreements already reached by carriers and unions and force them to be reopened. It will expose carriers and unions to more liabilities and litigation. Here's what raising the retirement age won't do. It won't increase the supply of pilots. It just won't. There are other better ways to increase the supply of pilots, like expanding workforce pipelines and improving pay, but attempting to do so by chipping away at a pilot's right to retire after a lifetime of service is not the right way to do it, and it won't work. By the way, my colleague from Michigan is Representative Jack Bergman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on my amendment 356 to HR 3935. This amendment is simple. It adds an additional 7 round-trip flights to Ronald Reagan National Airport. That equates to 1 route for each airline currently operating out of DCA. Not 28 routes, which was originally requested, not 14, which was a reasonable compromise, but 7. 1 route for each carrier. What is the result of each carrier having 1 additional route? It mitigates the high costs that millions of Americans must budget for to visit our national capital. This modest growth represents only 2% of increase in air traffic in and out of DCA. It's purely additive, poses no threat to existing services, and maintains all existing flight routes. This, by the way, is spelled out clearly in the amendment. I quote, "This amendment prohibits eliminating any present services when adding beyond perimeter flights." A nearly 60-year-old federally imposed perimeter rule has made Washington and Reagan one of the most expensive airports in the country. It is also the only airport in our nation that has been sheltered from the benefits of the free market by D.C. legislators. Those free market benefits of competition and meritocracy can be seen in every other sector of our society. It grants the American consumer best prices, best convenience, and best value. This bipartisan effort will begin to modernize the arbitrary, protectionist federal policies put in place for the economic protection of 1 airport and 1 airlines. This bipartisan effort will instead put the focus and priorities on the American consumer, the millions of our constituents, families, elementary and high school students, small business owners, and other D.C. visitors who have been priced out for years of the option to visit, learn, and redress their representatives in the nation's capital. We have an opposition that seeks to protect the status quo. That 60-year-old status quo is anti-consumer. By its nature, as a monopoly, it seeks to stifle competition and sends a very clear message back home to the American consumer. We are determined to keep our choices low, which will translate to you as keeping your flight tickets high. I want to highlight some of the amendment facts. Recent studies show that DCA has enough capacity to handle over 90 additional flights per day. This amendment adds only 7. Due to technological advancement and previous FAA authorizations, the number of Americans subject to significant aviation noise exposure has decreased by 94% from the 1970 perimeter rules that was first established. And due to the American innovation, we're just getting started. Allegations that this amendment benefits only 1 airline over another are patently false. This amendment benefits all airlines operating out of DCA equally. Each carrier will win an additional route. The biggest winner, though, will be the American consumer. With the free market choices, millions will get a best price, best value, best convenience. History has shown us the transformative power of compromise, and this bipartisan solution agreed on by both sides is indeed transformative. Every American should have the opportunity to visit their nation's capital and witness their government in action. This body should aggressively pursue opportunities to increase access for our constituents while working to decrease costs. I urge this committee to support our compromise and open the doors of Washington, D.C. to every citizen of this great country. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Before we go to the gentlelady from Texas, can I ask that we make room for Mr. Higgins to come up to the...
I'm fine, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to crowd anyone. I'll speak from behind.
I actually prefer him back there, the more distance between. He needs to speak.
Yeah, but we do need you to speak into a microphone so that the clerk can hear you. So let's...
Follow your instructions.
No, we're going this way.
So I agree that Mr. Reschenthaler had a reasonable thought
Yes, sir.
to increase the distance, but I appreciate you coming up. The gentlelady from Texas now recognized.
Again, let me thank the Rules Committee for their courtesies, and as well to the chairman and the ranking member for their courtesies. Start first with securing growth and robust leadership. I have an amendment to that bill known in the colloquial term as the FAA bill. And as I make my presentation on the amendment, let me say that I'm certainly glad that there is stated, as I was sitting here, bipartisan support or at least collaboration from the leaders of the committee. I know that in spite of that, there are some issues that we're all hoping to be able to have our amendments cover. I do want to, independent of any age question, do mention that I hope that there can be a workforce nexus to building and growing more pilots, and particularly with our HBCUs and minority-serving institutions, and cite in particular Texas Southern University, which I think may have either the oldest or the first aviation program training pilots, and collaborating with actual airlines to produce pilots ready to move into a training mode in our commercial airlines. And I hope that the FAA bill will provide expanded opportunity for that. But I'm offering Jackson Lee Amendment number 11, dealing with the overall health concerns that pilots face. I want to implement the creation of the Aviation Medical Innovation Modernization Working Group and a report on recommendations from the working group on the evaluation of the conditions an aviation medical examiner can issue, and improvements and reforms to the special issuance process, including whether after initial medical certification by the FAA, renewals can be based on a medical evaluation and treatment plan by pilots treating medical specialists with concurrence from the pilot's aviation medical examiner, in addition to other measures that will help ease the process and remove the backlog for when pilots return from medical leave. If you travel, as we all do, I often speak to the pilots in the cabin, obviously when the aircraft is on the ground, and others, and they often mention this enormous backlog of well-cured pilots ready to come back, and the process is beyond a snail's pace. And we're losing valuable hours, valuable talent, valuable readiness, because we cannot move them through quickly. This task force would allow this process to be expedited, or additional eyes to move forward. It would pilot a mental health task force group to develop and provide recommendations related to supporting the mental health of aircraft pilots. Finally, my amendment requests a report that would provide recommendations for best practices in detecting, assessing, and reporting mental health conditions and treatment options as part of a pilot aeromedical assessments. To answer the overall question, we want good health for our pilots. We have pilots who are ready to come back. The process is very slow, 2, 3, 5 years, and this creation of the Aviation Medical Innovation Modernization Working Group would help expedite this process. And I hope my colleagues will look seriously at this amendment and consider it to be included. I now would like to discuss amendments that I have for H.R. 3941, and certainly to my dismay, I think it was obvious that this amendment did not draw bipartisan support from the Committee on Education. I had thought that it might have been referred to Homeland Security, but erroneously it was not. FEMA has often used schools to assist and houses of worship and community centers as an option for congregate shelter. I remember after 9/11, we were even looking to shore up schools for places to protect communities during a terrorist attack. Obviously, the schools would have to be reinforced. For example, schools constituted on the disaster part of it, schools constituted 22% of shelters after Hurricane Katrina. And I know that we have amended the bill, or provided the fact that natural disasters were not excluded as they were originally in the bill. But just to think that that was the case, I believe that we have a commitment to humanitarian relief, and these schools can be used as such. It should be clear that the states that have been using the schools had firewalls between, if there are any existing students, and the migrant children. In addition, most schools were finding schools that were empty or not being used. They were not attempting to use active schools in most instances. So I have a Jackson Lee Amendment number 13, which simply prevent the enactment of H.R. 3941 until we actually address and enact comprehensive immigration reform in the United States, such as the federal immigration system operates efficiently and offers a fair, humane, and orderly pathway to citizenship In the spirit of the late John McCain, that is what we have failed to do since 2008, 2010. And we really should be ashamed of ourselves. We continue to bicker, fight, and argue, and talk about the openness of the border and fail to ensure that we have a comprehensive approach to it, which I think we could do in a bipartisan manner. The Jackson Lee Amendment number 15 would also prevent enactment of this bill until my bill, the Grant Relief for American Children's Elevation Act of 2023, is implemented such that the exceptional and extremely unusual hardship term as defined in Section 240AB of the Immigration and Nationality Act is amended to include hardship resulting from separating a family member who is a United States citizen, a lawful permanent resident, or an individual lawfully admitted to the United States, and a family member who is subject to deportation or removal from the United States. With a stabilized family member here, it certainly would seem that there could be another appropriate manner to avoid the deportation of that particular family member, to avoid separation. It is not a complicated process, and it is not a complicated amendment. It may seem that, as someone might note. The American Academy of Pediatrics has noted that highly stressful experiences like family separation can cause irreparable harm, disrupting a child's brain, architecture, and affecting his or her short-term and long-term health. I would hope that we would be more apt to be concerned about school takeovers, such as the one at the Houston Independent School District by TEA, and as well to do something about gun violence, as opposed to stopping schools from being centers of humanitarian relief. Finally, the last amendment strikes the final language of this very short bill, and I think there's such great concern that you would that this legislature would penalize schools that are so desperately in need of federal aid, because most of these shelters do find themselves in most likely inner city neighborhoods. So you're literally cutting off federal financial assistance for states and cities that are desperate to try and be responsible after receiving unpredictable bus trips from other states making political points. Schools should not be politicized, and this idea of migrants should not be politicized, and to penalize states that I don't live in that are trying to find some credible relief temporarily because other states' bad behavior is just really unnecessary. So my amendment takes the word not out and reads that as a condition of receipt of federal aid, et cetera, that the school institution may be used to provide shelter or housing for specified aliens under appropriate protection and law enforcement protection as well. So I ask my colleagues to support under the School Secure Bill, Jackson Lee Amendments 13, 15, and 16, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to come together and work together on comprehensive immigration reform, where we're going back to the values of this nation, where the statute of liberty clearly indicated that we take those who are forlorn and desperate to be able to assist where we could. My final words are that we have seen migration not just in the north and south, in this hemisphere, northern and southern hemisphere, but we see it all over the world. Things are changing, and there must be, of course, credible responses when that kind of crisis happens. I just want to put this on the record, Mr. Chairman. It did not include freeze in its list of numbers of disasters, and we will be putting in a late amendment whether it gets accepted, but I thought it was important since Houston had a Texas had a devastating freeze, over 150 people died, and I don't think any of the listing of the disasters clarified that it would cover a freeze. A snowstorm is not a freeze, and we didn't have a snowstorm. We had a below temperature that we had never experienced in the state of Texas as people died. So I yield back, and I look forward to my amendments hopefully being made in order. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. There's a unanimous consent request from Representative Brian Steele that his statement be inserted into the record without objection. So ordered. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Ranking Member, for giving me the opportunity to testify on the amendments that I have submitted to the FAA Reauthorization Act. Since before I was elected to Congress, my district has been afflicted by excessive aviation-related noise. I campaign on addressing these issues, and today, with the amendments and testimony, I'm following through on my commitment to offer relief to my constituents. If enacted, the changes I will be seeking today will lower the permissible decibel levels that aircrafts can produce. Request studies to analyze the development of noise abatement technology, the effect of airport noise on communities within 10-mile radius of an airport, and inquire into the success of the Next-Gen program. In addition, I propose an amendment that will allow airport ramp staff to receive hazard pay. Since taking office, I visited with people of New York stirred who have begged me to take action on this matter, often with tears in their eyes. Most people will suppose this is an exaggeration, but most people have no idea what it is to live right next to one of the largest airport hubs in the country. The FAA prioritizes efficiency over my constituents' well-being, and I understand that as a public safety, as a matter of public safety, we need to have efficiency, but both are not mutually exclusive one to the other. I'm here today to see that stops. I'll give some examples, and pardon me if it gets super technical, but a great example is we can make more use of RNAVX arrival path 22, which is the preferred arrival path from the air traffic controllers in JFK with the next-gen technology when calls for 22s. RNAV is a next-gen path created to use 22s under certain conditions, low winds, less volume. In addition, before 22I ILS South was created, RNAV overlaid the VOR approach to 22s, the only approach used then for JFK arrivals in 22. Air traffic control was able to use RNAV path as a sole 22 approaches when it was VOR. Why wouldn't they be able to do it and make it more use of it today? It simply comes down to ground operation capital projects. We understand that air traffic control's preferred JFK arrival runway is 31S. However, they don't use it as often as they'd like to do due to insufficiencies in ground operations. Since the runway used for 31 arrivals do not have a taxiway to support high-volume landings, air traffic control then calls for 22. Even if the conditions aren't calling for 22, they make it work with the configuration at hand. So, long story short, Next-Gen has been implemented since 2012. All I'm requesting in one of the amendments is that we do an extensive review over the last 10 years to see how it's impacted the lives of the people living within a 10-mile radius of an airport. I'll give a perfect example. As born and raised in New York City, I've lived within 1.5 miles of LaGuardia Airport my entire life. I'm 34 years old, 35 later this week. I've grown used to it, but I don't believe that it should be a way of life that should burden everybody. I appreciate expansion of airport. I appreciate the expansion of competition, lower rates, and opportunity to travel. The issue here at hand is it's just to see and give a realistic approach for the people living within the path of a flight. So just to give you guys some numbers, between June 24, 2023 and July 9, 2023, there are 395 hours. During that time frame, only 7 runways were elected to be used at JFK for landing, for arrivals. 325 of those hours, they selected the same runway approach, which is the 22L and the 22R, which causes for 82% of all arriving traffic to take the same exact route every re-entry to JFK, causing for unprecedented amount of hurt for these people for a span of 13 and a half days. Now, just imagine airplanes flying anywhere from 3,000 to 1,200 feet above your house for 325 hours in a span of 13 days. That's all I'm asking for. And Mr. Chairman, I'm also asking for us to keep in mind that transport workers keep our country going, and I'm a proud supporter of their effort to advocate for fair working conditions. Airlines posted record profits in 2022. We assisted them throughout the pandemic. I think it's only fair that we consider and institute a hazard work pay environment for agents working on the ramp at airports across the country. It gives them a better quality of life and better access to health care. Mr. Chair, distinguished members of the committee, I urge you to please consider the amendments. Number 6, 135, 142, 146, 307, put forth in front of you today for the better quality of life of the American people. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate everyone on the Rules Committee for working so hard through the amendment process. I have filed 4 amendments, which I would ask the Rules Committee to consider. My first amendment, amendment number 203, will prohibit funding from being used to promote the LGBTQ initiatives and policies within the FAA. My amendment is an important one because we need to stop talking about the way people sexually identify with taxpayer dollars. The FAA website and Twitter account are frequently post LGBTQ content that should have no place in our aviation administration. And I think it's important to acknowledge at this time the mission statement of the Federal Aviation Administration, which is our continuing mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. Talking about people's sexual identity has nothing to do with this mission statement. I would also like to remind everyone, and I think this is important to talk about, the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, which states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Our preamble of the Declaration of Independence recognizes that all men are created equal. We don't need to promote people's sexual identity with our tax dollars. We know that people are equal, and we recognize that. But I would like to show the committee here that the FAA Twitter account spends a lot of time talking about sexual identity, as they frequently post on their Twitter account, talking about everything from Pride Month to Trans Awareness Week, recognizing different people for their sexual identity. Again, this does nothing to keep us safe on airplanes. The FAA committee recommends shifting to gender-neutral language. I don't see any need or concern for gender-neutral language with the FAA. This is, again, the mission statement, it's important to remember, is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. Not about people's sexual identity. My next amendment that I would like to talk about will prohibit any taxpayer funding for DEI, the DEI agenda. Again, our taxpayer dollars should not go for a woke agenda promoting this. But this is, again, what is talked about. Here's a tweet from the FAA that says, "The language we use in aerospace matters. We've begun to adopt gender-neutral and inclusive aviation terminology as part of our agency-wide initiative. You can watch our Inclusive Language Summit," and it gives a link, and then hashtag equity. How much money did the taxpayers spend on inclusive language summits? I think the American people care more about taking off and landing safely. They tweet frequently about it as well.
The gentlelady will suspend for just a moment. The Rules Committee generally doesn't prohibit exhibits. If you have material you wish to submit for the record, you may do so.
Okay, I'll be happy to submit this for the record. Again, the Twitter account speaks frequently of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these are things that shouldn't be talked about. They should stick with their mission statement, which is providing the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. That's what's most important. My third amendment requires airlines to look at reinstating pilots who were fired or forced to resign because of vaccine mandates. Hundreds of pilots were forced out of their livelihoods over the past several years for their refusal to get COVID vaccines. They were denied medical freedom to decide whether they should take the experimental COVID vaccine or lose their job. My amendment requires airlines to right their wrongs and look at reinstating these pilots who were forced out over the vaccine mandate. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that one particular airline, and for example, United Airlines, there were approximately close to 600 employees that faced termination for failing to comply with the vaccine mandate. The last amendment that I would like to the Rules Committee to look at would require the Inspector General to investigate the FAA's decision to broaden the acceptable EKG range for pilots to fly. Late last year, after the vaccine rollout, the Federal Aviation Administration quietly changed the EKG parameters for pilots. The October 2022 version of the FAA Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners widened the range acceptable for pilots to fly. The number of medical events that triggered official reporting requirements among U.S. military pilots rose more than 1,700% from 2019 to 2022. Recently, an Army flight surgeon and prominent opponent of the U.S. military's COVID-19 vaccine mandate posted data on Twitter showing that the number of reportable medical events among military aviators rose from an average 226 a year between 2016 and 2019 to over 4,000 in 2022, according to the Defense Medical Epidemiology Database. My amendment simply instructs the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation to conduct an investigation into this FAA decision. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And let me just ask the gentlelady seeking unanimous consent to include the materials she brought in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments before the committee for consideration that have been considered germane to the FAA reauthorization in 93, amendment number Higgins 93 and Higgins 95. I'd like to address them both as they are related. As a matter of background, we're discussing the intersection between FAA authority and law enforcement authority on the ground, primarily at the border. And as a matter of background for that, let me say that very, very few Americans have been involved in any way in an aircraft crash, but most of us have been involved in a vehicle crash. So let me clarify what my amendments will do in a way that every member of the committee will understand. In the state of Louisiana, and this is replicated across the sovereign states, if a vehicle crashes, one vehicle or 10, the investigating authority must complete what's called a Louisiana Uniform Motor Vehicle Crash Report. That's a vehicle crash. We call it an accident, right? And law enforcement is called a crash. However, if law enforcement takes an action, the difference between a crash and a law enforcement action is what I'm getting at here. If law enforcement uses a technique in a pursuit called a pit maneuver to cause that fleeing vehicle to crash, then a Louisiana Uniform Motor Vehicle Crash Report is not completed because that's considered a law enforcement action. The details of that vehicle crash are included in the criminal report of the investigative authority. Same thing if we use strips to blow out the tires of a fleeing vehicle, that vehicle crashes. There's no Louisiana State Uniform Motor Vehicle Crash Report completed because clearly that was a law enforcement action and is documented within the law enforcement jurisdictional authority report. So on the border, we have technology that can detect and mitigate cartel drone action. And we've had it for several years. There's been some of late, shall we say within the last couple of years, some level of trepidation for the law enforcement officials to use what's considered the offensive capabilities of this anti-drone tech, which is to land or crash that drone. We're talking about small drones the kind that you can buy. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of them in operation right now on the border. Cartels are using them very, very effectively, primarily as scouts. So we have technology that tracks these drones very effectively, and we keep a map of that. And anytime law enforcement determines it's a good idea to capture that drone, they have line of sight on that drone, the men in the field. They have the technology at their disposal to interrupt the radio signal of that drone, that cartel drone. And what happens is, with an older model drone, it'll crash. A newer model drone, the last few years, when it loses its signal from its home beacon, it just lands. And then our law enforcement guys go collect that drone and turn it over to the investigators within their department for DNA collection, fingerprints, look at the memory files, the cards, the photographs, etc. It's a treasure of evidence within that drone. So, my amendment number 93 would ask the Inspector General to conduct an investigation regarding exactly what has happened, why has the FAA has there been any interaction between the FAA and the Border Patrol law enforcement boots on the ground regarding the offensive capabilities of our anti-drone technology. Because for the last year or so, we've been using the defensive capabilities, the tracking capabilities of this technology, but not the mitigating or offensive capabilities of our anti-drone technology. We haven't been landing them. Allegedly, it's because it has come from on high that it's considered a crash. So the FAA would have authority, and therefore there's been there's been hesitation to use the offensive capability. My amendment number 93 would quite simply ask the Inspector General to look into that. My amendment number 95 clarifies that the FAA has no authority regarding a law enforcement action of an unmanned aircraft system, a drone, as opposed to a crash. So those are my two amendments. I thank the committee for allowing me to speak on them, and I encourage support on both sides of the aisle for amendments number 93 and 95. I yield.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Today I'm making the case for an amendment to the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Act of 2023 to exempt Guam from the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, also known as the Jones Act. This act unfairly affects Guam with its requirements that only U.S.-operated ships may transit between U.S. ports. It distorts the free market of our country holds near and dear and makes Guam's cost of living unnecessarily high and extends shipping processes. In other words, it gets more expensive and it takes longer for us to get our goods. So in addition, I just came back from witness the devastation of Typhoon Mawar to the island and at least what it unleashed to the people of Guam and when it passed a few months ago, and I'm determined to do everything possible to support my district. And the Jones Act regulations also have implications for our national defense posture. So since Guam lies right in the middle of the Indo-Pacific, my district receives most of its petroleum from Asia. Foreign ships steaming from Asia to the United States may only transit directly to their destinations. These ships would generally be unable to, for example, stop by Guam on their way to the end destination, and vice versa. So carriers must choose where to unload their cargo and transfer their cargo to the U.S.-operated ships. These regulations cost valuable time and resources. The Jones Act is well known in Guam as a major reason why many families struggle to put groceries on the table. We have a USDA data that shows us there are 63% of families with children in Guam are on SNAP assistance, which is the largest proportion in our country. Guam does not need to have a sales tax, or we don't have a sales tax, but the cost of living is already inflated due to the Jones Act. So add the devastation from Typhoon Mawar and Guam, we'll have many more struggling families in the years to come. So the storm flooded Guam's airports and impeded the ability for people and resources to effectively transit to our island. And when the airport did reopen, it serviced humanitarian and cargo flights. So I'm really proud to share that many of our efforts related to the National Defense Authorization Act secured many defense priorities that involve Guam. And implementing these priorities effectively and on a timely basis is the next step. The Jones Act stiff regulations presents a burden on the country's ability to safeguard a free and open Indo-Pacific region by complicating shipping logistics. So I urge my colleagues to recognize Guam's unique position in the American family, and people who were already struggling to make ends meet face growing pains post-typhoon. So let's exempt Guam from the Jones Act and reinforce our position in the Indo-Pacific region. And I thank you, fellow members of Congress, for your time today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for spending so much time with us. I have no further questions, so I'm going to yield to Mr. Reschenthal.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I failed to present my second amendment to the FAA reauthorization. I promise it'll be the briefest of all of the amendments if allowed to present it.
Please proceed.
Thank you, sir. Amendment 190 to the FAA reauthorization for 2023 is a bipartisan amendment. My colleague from Texas, Jake Elzy, is a co-sponsor. And of course, I appreciate the work that you're doing to mandate that all commercial air flights carry naloxone on board. Naloxone, the name of the generic drug is Narcan. It's a life-saving medicine that quickly reverses and blocks the effects of an opioid overdose. 83,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses in 2022. It was a new tragic record. There have been numerous instances of people having overdoses while on airplanes. There are lives that could be saved if only there were Narcan on board. I thank my colleagues from Texas as well as Representatives Trone and Peterson for their leadership on this bipartisan step forward. This amendment will make our skies safer and it will save lives. I urge you to make Amendment 190 in order. Thank you.
And Chair, again, thanks, gentlemen. Chair recognizes Mr. Reschenthal for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I just want to thank all the members for coming in and providing testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who brought us thoughtful amendments relevant to this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Massey, did you have any questions for yourself?
I have no questions for myself on my amendment, but the gentleman from Guam, I had some questions about the exemption to the Jones Act for your amendment. Would it just be for Guam, or would it be for other U.S. territories?
I'm sure it will be very helpful for the other U.S. territories as well.
But your particular amendment
is for Guam.
Just for Guam.
Right.
And would it allow a foreign flag vessel to carry goods from Guam to the United States and back? Or is it these three-legged trips that you're talking about? Would it only apply to those?
Because right now, they go from Asia side to Los Angeles. They unload, re-put them on the U.S. flagship, then they come back our way. So that the total cost is, it basically doubles the product. And what we've invested into Guam for the national defense and the buildup in Guam, we're paying extra than we have to for all this billions of dollars that we're putting in from the NDAA. In addition, it would also support the people of Guam by bringing down the cost of goods as well. So if we can get that track where they don't have to go that far and they can just directly come to us, of course it would help. So we're asking for the exception that will really help with the defense of our nation and the help for our people of Guam.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Just a couple of questions for my friend from Utah, Mr. Owens. Your amendment is for 7 slots, additional additional slots for DCA, for Reagan, correct? And just as a reminder to make sure I heard you correctly, 1966 is when the perimeter rule, the so-called perimeter rule, was adopted, affecting DCA, affecting Reagan National Airport. Now, I think there's some like 800-ish flights that come in and out of Reagan, touchdowns, takes off every single day today. Some people are raising concerns about the traffic that might increase if you have 7 additional slots added. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I don't know if the gentleman's advised. You may not be. There certainly weren't 800 flights coming in and out of Reagan in 1966 or in 1985 when it was raised from, I think, about, I can't remember what the exact number was, but it was increased, the mileage was increased from about 600 miles in terms of the perimeter in 1966 to about 1,250 miles, again, arbitrarily selected by legislators in 85-ish, mid-80s. But the traffic's gone up immensely in terms of the number of flights in and out of Reagan National Airport. Is that correct? And there are 10 cities that have exemptions currently from the 1,250-mile rule. Is that correct? I think Salt Lake City is one. Austin, Texas is one. I'm able to avail myself of the one direct flight that goes from Austin to Reagan. I think I'm just trying to clarify for the record for people. There's been a lot of debate about this. I mean, right now, the people who are opposed to this are predominantly those airlines who have, frankly, monopolies, right? United Airlines. American was opposed to your initial version of 28 slots. Now that it's down to 7, it's kind of a neutral, soft opposed. Southwest favors. There are others, depending on the markets. And I think that's telling. I think for the American people to understand this. What we're trying to do is free up competition. Trying to free up the ability of people to be able to fly directly to the national airport inside, right here at the nation's capital. And in my case, total parochial issue, 100%, I acknowledge, San Antonio, 7th largest city in the country. We do not have a direct flight from San Antonio to to DCA. Unless people are thinking this is personal, I will probably not take that flight very often. My home is much closer to the Austin airport where I have a direct flight. But the people of San Antonio, military city that have Joint Base San Antonio and have a lot of business with the Department of Defense, and in Washington, they can't get a direct flight to Reagan. And the reason is, and I assume the gentleman agrees, is effectively an arbitrary rule set in place in 1966. And so I think what the gentleman has done is starting with 28, working to try to get to something reasonable, and he got it down to 13 or 14. Now today, I think the amendment that the gentleman's offering is 7 slots to free up competition in or out of the perimeter, to allow each airline essentially to be able to vie for a slot, in essence, to be able to free up competition and allow other cities and places around the country to get a direct flight to Reagan. Is that a fair summary?
It is, yes. And let me just say this also. The FAA has already found that there's a lot of unutilized slots that can be used. And I think it really comes down to one simple thing. This is the only airport that actually has federalized in terms of a parameter set by legislators. Every other airport is in the free market. And at the end of the day, think about what we were talking about here. Every other sector has a free market in place. So the price comes down, quality goes up, convenience, all that is part of everything we do every single day, other than those trying to fly to the nation's capital. I just can imagine millions of people, young children, high school kids, small business owners trying to have access to their legislators cannot afford to do so. To me, this is as basic as it comes. I've actually heard someone make the comment that this is kind of a selfish thing for us, those members who want to fly in directly. And I've never thought that the free market was a selfish process for the consumer. We represent millions of people that are trying to get here. They cannot afford to write off their trip, cannot afford to just get on the flight and come because we have the government taking care of it. This is something that every American should have an opportunity to come to be educated, to address their representatives, and just to let the market flow. One other point there, it's also going to help Dulles. One thing about the free market, there's a tendency when it's a monopoly that the service is not as good as it could be because it's not competition. Everybody benefits, including Dulles, including all those, of course, Ronald Reagan. So I'm hoping that we can get past some of the fiction. There's a lot of fiction going on. This is a win-win across the board for everybody, and we don't lose out any routes that are presently in place for those that have small airports.
Yeah, the gentleman says, so no one is going to lose a flight under this plan, correctly? And it specifically contains language that will protect in-perimeter flights that currently exist, for better or worse, by the way. I might be able to make an argument, but right now it has language that specifically protects that, correct? Yes. And 7 slots would be less than 2% of the current slots at DCA, right? And so, and I just want to reiterate one last point, the point that and the reason I raised it, because people are going to no doubt write stories. Oh, you want your direct flight. Again, I might take a flight from here to San Antonio to make some event at some point. I can imagine a scenario where I will. But 99% of the flights I'm going to be taking are going to be right out of Austin. I've got the direct flight there. But for I think it's 159,000 odd veterans or something in the San Antonio area, for Joint Base San Antonio, for all of the businesses there, a city of 1.6 million people, San Antonio, Texas, is completely unable to have a direct flight to Ronald Reagan National Airport because of an arbitrary rule set up by this body. It is time for that to end, and I'm going to be pushing this very hard on the floor and going forward with whatever happens in the Senate. It's time for this to end. I'm kind of beyond the back and forth on this as being something that's a reasonable debate. The perimeter rule is archaic. If we want to have a debate about slots, let's have a debate about slots. But I'm not going to sit here and allow San Antonio and other cities to be restricted from their ability to be able to access an airport for an arbitrary reason and not a reasonable one. To the gentlelady from Georgia, I just want to thank the gentlelady from Georgia for offering the amendments that she's offered with respect to DEI and with respect to the other issues that she raises. I'm still not sure which ones will be yet. I'm not sure which ones are made in order relative to other ones for various rules. Those are critically important, I think. And as we saw last week on the NDAA, these are things that should not be at the front and center of a federal administration that's focus is supposed to be on aviation safety and not on promoting effectively social engineering. And I appreciate that the gentlelady offered those amendments and the other amendments for, specifically with respect to the vax mandates. I know there's one that's been made in order or that's being talked about or about ensuring that there's no mask requirements and other stuff, vax mandates for passengers. But the gentlelady's point about pilots who lost their ability to carry out their livelihoods because they dared to stand up and say, hey, wait a second, why are you doing this? And then the other issue that she raises with respect to EKGs and questions about the impact on what's going on there. Why are they changing the standards with respect to EKGs? And I would note it's interesting that I've had some people complaining about lifting the pilot age 2 years when we're talking about having the same EKG tests and stuff, yet the FAA is watering down the EKG standards, and we're trying to figure out why. So I appreciate the gentlelady's amendments. I yield back.
Yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. The gentlelady from Minnesota have any questions?
Would
I mentioned, if I just, thank you, have a process point that I need to make. I mentioned the amendment to the Schools Not Shelters Act in the listing of disasters, that there was not one that included a freeze, which occurred in the state of Texas. It's not covered by a snowstorm. So I know that for process sake, just to let the committee know that there is an amendment from me. It's amendment number 19, and it has been submitted. And maybe the committee will be gracious enough to make that minor change in the list of disasters to add freeze to the Schools for Shelters Act of 2023. It has been submitted. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Are there any other questions for this panel? Seeing none, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and they are now excused. Is there anyone else seeking to testify on H.R. 3941 or H.R. 3935? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.